Hello and welcome to another kind of lively discussion on plants. I will get my pointer options set up right now and we will get going. In chapter 28, basically, we're looking at a number of things and I'll get into there. Plants are very important to our civilization. And actually, very few plants are very important to our civilizations. And hopefully you know that about 20% of all the calories consumed worldwide are due to the plant wheat. Plants are responsible for our food, our fuel, our clothing, and countless other trappings of kind of modern life. And so here's a picture of a nice field of wheat here that kind of we all depend upon. Again, looking about the history, about 10,000 years ago, we had a major shift occur. Basically, we started to domesticate plants, and we produced a surplus of food, and therefore we can live in larger and larger villages, and we can specialize. And that's going off into other things. And and again, we want to look at human beings, and basically through selective breeding, genetic engineering, we basically doubled our yields from 1940 to 1980. So that, again, and we cut the production of wheat in half. That is the number of man-hours that are required to do this. And so this is truly a green revolution that we had. In order to support the number of people that live on our planet, we continuously need to have these green revolutions. Okay? Again, plants are very vital to the well-being of the Earth's biosphere. They provide shelter, food, and breeding areas for animals, fungi, and microorganisms. They're very important. Again, plants and specific angiosperms, and we'll talk about the evolution of plants in a little bit. They make up 90% of the plant kingdom. And again, the angiosperms are the topics of these next two lectures that we're going to have. Again, the angiosperms have dominated land plants for over 100 million years. There's over 250,000 species that are alive today. They are very diverse. Again, most of our food comes from about 100 or so domesticated species of flowering plants, and these include the roots, beets and carrots, fruits, which include apples, nuts, berries, squash, fruits, seeds, legumes, such as peas and peanuts, fruits and grasses, grains, wheat, rice, corn, roughly about 100 of them. When we look at plants, there's two major types, monocots and dicots. No, you can't change from a monocot to a dicot. You can't be a monocot living in a dicot's body. There's a biochemical and physical change between those. And so we'll talk about those in a little bit. Basically, I do want you to know these differences or be able to look it up. Monocots have one seed cotyledon. The veins are usually in parallel. The vascular bundles are scattered arrangement. Floral parts are usually multiples of 3. They usually have a fibrous root systems, and things like corn and a lot of our grass kind of materials are like this. The eudicots or dicots have 2 seed cotyledons. Floral parts using multiple of 5, and they usually have a taproot system, and we'll go over that a little bit. The other things that we want to look at is the parts of the plant, and we typically divide this up into the roots, the stems, and the leaves. And again, when we're talking about multicellular organisms, and we'll talk about how those evolved in a little bit, but basically we have these organs that are composed of different tissues, and so we want to look at what these organs are. Again, land plants evolved from basically algae growing in the water. They have structures for absorbing water and minerals from the soil. They have large light collecting surfaces. They have adaptations for surviving in dry conditions. And so this is a typical plant that we have. We have the roots are below ground. The shoots are above ground. The shoots consist of your your leaves, which consists of the blade, which is the photosynthetic part, the petiole, which basically attaches it to the stem, which consists of the internode and then the nodes, and you will know all of those parts. The roots anchor the plants to the soil. They store food, they absorb and transport mineral, and we look at the root system. The roots have root hairs, which are tiny projections to the root tips. Large taproots, such as plants. They can also buttress. So again, here are the large taproots that can store stuff. Here are other root structures that can store stuff and hold stuff in place. Again, we know those parts. We know this axillary buds. Apical dominance is basically we have a dominant part of the plant. Apical, if we remove that, the plant gets a little bit lower level and bushy. Again, we can see when animals eat off the tops of plants, they tend to get lower and bushy. Stems take many forms. You should know kind of so strawberries, runners, rhizomes, and then taproot. You should know what the parts of the leaf are, and so here's the blade, here's the petiole, and this one here are all the blades, and then here's the petiole, and basically the petiole is the part that attaches to the stem or to the shoot. And so even though there's a lot of little leaflets in here, we wouldn't really call them a leaf because again the axillary bud is right there. The axillary bud is when a leaf falls out where would a new leaf grow from. Leaves can be modified in a number of different ways. We have tendrils and the spines of cactus are leaves. So those are organs. We want to look at tissues. The tissues are a group of cells that perform a common structure or function. The two main tissues that we're going to look at are a kind of ground stem tissue and vascular tissue and dermal tissue. The phloem and xylem of a plant are two very important tissues that we need to know. The phloems transport sugars. The xylems transport water from the bases to the top. We have dermal, vascular, and ground tissue systems when we look at plants. These are connected all throughout a plant, these particular ones. So the vascular tissue basically moves stuff from one part of the plant to another. The dermal tissue covers the plant, and the ground tissue kind of supports and does everything else that we want to see inside of a plant. Again, here's a cross-section of a root. We have the xylem and the phloem inside the root here. We have a cortex and endodermis and an epidermis, which is an outer portion. And so there's kind of two main kind of skin layers inside of here. And then here's the ground tissue inside there. This is looking at a leaf. So we have the palocydes tissue here. Again, they have chlorophylls in here, so it's photosynthetic. We have the xylem and the phloem inside of here, and they do things. And basically, we have an outer cuticle, an outer surface of the plant that's responsible for holding up the outside of the plant. Again, when we look at plant cells, we typically would see a chloroplast, which is a site of photosynthesis, a central vacuole that maintains the cell's firmness, or what we call a turgor, and then a supportive cell wall for a particular plant. So here's a typical plant that we would see. Here's the cell wall that surrounds it. We have the central vacuole that supports it, the DNA and the nucleus and all that stuff, and the chloroplasts, which are the little factories that kind of make the sugars within there. The plasmodesmata are basically structures that allow nutrients to move from one cell to another. Okay, we're not going to get into these types of cells, but these are kind of the ground cells, the rest of the cells that make up the body. Trestle and vessel elements are part of the phloem. Actually, these are part of the xylem, and they conduct water throughout a plant. The food-containing cells are the plasmodesmata, basically are the phloem. The thing about phloem is the phloem cells are still alive, and so they have a plasma membrane. The xylem cells don't need to be alive, and so that's very critical. When we look at plant growth, we have what's called determinate growth and indeterminate growth. And that is basically most plants can grow throughout their lifespans. Most animals, basically, once they reach a certain growth set, they do not grow any at all. You should know that we have annuals, we have biannuals, and perennials, which are plants that live for many, many years. And again, kind of take a look at those and what types those are. And next, we'll look at kind of how a plant grows. We have the stuff that we call the apical meristem. And at the very ends of most of our shoots and our roots, we have this non-differentiated tissue that's able to divide, and that's able to become any part of the cells. This includes the root cap in a cell. So this is so basically here's the meristematic tissue, and this tissue will release this root cap, and then we'll start the growth. And so what's happening is when a cell grows, it only grows, it lays down the material in this region. This region expands, and then we have the material in there. Secondary growth is basically growth around the cylinder. And so primary growth would be growth along the length, and then secondary growth would be growth of the girth, or of how these things get a little bit wider. Okay, and so how that happens is here we have that epidermal tissue, you have your vascular tissue, and here's your secondary meristem here. And basically what happens is secondary meristem puts down phloem on this side and xylem on the inside, and it continues to grow, and so this phloem actually gets crushed, and so there's a relatively thin layer of phloem here all the time, as the xylem can expand ultimately to what we see. And then here we see that growth that we have. Again, annual growth rings result from the layer of secondary xylem and phloem on there, and so here we have the annual rings on here. Here we have the heartwood, the saproot, which is where the phloem is coming. Here we have the xylem, and then we have those materials, and so we'll continuously be able to look at those. Wow, I'm not being as articulate as I wish I would be, so I'm sorry about that. Again, we need to look at this, and we'll look at that a little bit in class. So the life cycle of flowering plant. And so what we talked about is the parts of the plant and how the plant basically grows. The next thing that we got to talk about is this thing that we call sexual reproduction. In asexual reproduction, you can basically take a stick of a plant and it would grow. Here's holly trees that are growing, little rootlets that are growing up. Creosote bushes can grow. Here's an original creosote bush, and then as the plants go, and then here we have multiple garlic materials that are out of there. But what we want to see is sexual reproduction. And in plants, they have a specialized structure called the flower. And we'll take a look at the flower during our laboratory this week a little bit more. In many flowers, we have modified leaves. We have sepals, petals, stamens, and carpels. Again, the stigma is the female portion of the flower, which contains the ovary. We have the anther, which is the male portion of the flowers. The sepals are the green parts that are closest to the shoot, and then we have the flower parts and kind of what those are. And we'll go on that. And so basically what's happening when we have a flower that's basically a modified leaf, what it's able to do is it will actually grow into a fruit, and your seed is still going to be inside the fruit. And the fruit is consisting of this ovarian tissue that's in there, but when a fruit drops or rots or transports or whatever like that, it becomes the other ones. And I see my time is up, but I need to continue to go. And so how this fertilization is happening is we have a pollen grain that basically will, this grain will divide into 4 pollen cells, each of which is haploid. That pollen grain will actually eventually fertilize these nuclei, but again, there's so the egg cell inside of here. So it's really kind of interesting. What we call a double fertilization. So when this pollen grain falls on top of the stamen, it will actually grow down with 2 nuclei into the ovule, and it will fertilize. It will fertilize the embryo as well as the endosperm. And it's the endosperm which will basically feed the organism. And so here we have this. So here we have the endosperm kind of right here, and here we have the embryo and its number of cotyledons kind of right there. And the fruit will act as the substance that will kind of support that. And then in leaf germination is where we have the seeds that are kind of coming out, and we'll talk about that a little bit. All right, thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope